needs the help the most. Many Americans did much more than that. These guys are members of what became known as the Lafayette Escadrille. These are rich Americans, for the most part, who decided that giving their money wasn't enough. They formed their own aviation squadron and fought for the French Air Force. The guy behind the lion cub there, that you can barely see, the mustache guy there, is Billy Thaw. I gotta say it, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Son of one of the richest men in the United States, the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was then the largest corporation in the United States. In 1911, Billy Thaw had America's first private pilot's license and flew an airplane underneath the Brooklyn Bridge. In late 1914, he got an idea to get together and form this aviation squadron. Americans loved it. Cornelius Vanderbilt wrote him a check. Do whatever you want. Live whatever kind of lifestyle you want. Theodore Roosevelt wrote articles praising them in Collier's magazine. So that's what they did. They had two lion cubs, whiskey and soda. You can see whiskey there. Soda's right there. I don't know how that went with the puppy on the far right, but whatever. And these guys lived the life they wanted to live. I half suspect, without being able to prove it, that this is where fighter-pilot culture comes from. The French had no incentive to discipline them because of the PR link that they were, and they were great pilots. They had a phenomenal combat record. And the Americans, of course, had no way of disciplining them because they were under French authority. President Wilson threatened to take away their citizenship, seeing this as an unneutral act. And when he got so much blowback from the American people, he just backed away from that idea. Jonathan Vance, a scholar at the University of Western Ontario, estimates that 80,000 members of the Canadian Armed Forces were American-born. That means Americans are crossing the border into Canada to volunteer for the British Army. Now, I've come across the records of just a couple of them, some of which indicate that some of them may have been volunteering for not the most noble of reasons, but it's still 80,000. I found the records of one who escaped because he got a girl pregnant, another one because he was jailed or escaped to the British Army. Nevertheless, they're not joining the German Army. There's also a scholar working on 15,000 Americans who volunteered to join the French Army through the consulate in New Orleans before that program got shut down. In other words, tens of thousands of Americans, some of them quite famous. Joyce Kilmer is one. Delwyn Starr, whose name is not that well known today, but a famous Harvard football player back in the day. All of this is coming around this debate of what America's relationship should be to the First World War. I can only find one example, one person who joined the Central Powers armies, and that's an American doctor who went and joined the Austro-Hungarian army as a medic, believing that nationality didn't matter. He had to go where there was suffering. This is the monument the French built in the Parc de Gauche just west of Paris to the Lafayette Escadrille flyers. Here's the part I want to get to. In 1916, there is a kind of decline in concern about what's happening in the First World War because the United States had a very close presidential election, turned out to be the closest in American history until the Bush-Gore election of 2000. But there is a concern that by staying neutral and doing nothing, the United States is making itself less safe, not more. And I want to show you one more image that you find when you're doing research, and this one stops you in your tracks. What I'm about to show you is the cover on Life magazine on February 10th, 1916. And I want you to please keep the date in mind. February 10th, 1916. This is the cover. I showed this in Canada 3 days ago. Let me explain what I think is going on. Now, I had to explain this in Canada too. I don't think the map maker and Life magazine were calling the Canadians barbarians. On the whole, they're lovely people. Here's what I think is going on. What the Americans are worried about, what the United States government is worried about, what the American people are worried about, what people on the dinner table in Knoxville, Tennessee are worried about, is that by doing nothing, the United States may put itself in an impossible position. If, and let's just say if, Germany does very well on the battlefield in 1916, and the British and French feel pressured to do something about that, they might do what Europeans have done in North America throughout the centuries. They might sacrifice parts of their overseas empires in order to keep more of what they have in Europe. And I'm reading a book right now called The History of Canada in 10 Maps, and it's all about this. Here's the fear. By doing nothing, here's the position the U.S. could find itself in. If Germany wins, or looks like it's going to win, maybe France and Britain trade their islands in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Martinique, to Germany. Remember, all of Canada is the British Empire. This is the reference to barbarians. It isn't that Americans are afraid that Canadians are turning into barbarians. The reference here is what happens if the British Empire surrenders all or part of Canada to Germany. It is for this reason that William Jennings Bryan, now the ex-Secretary of State, seriously proposed buying Canada for $100 million. The United States did buy the Danish Virgin Islands from Denmark for fear that Germany would take them from Denmark and build naval bases there. 1916 is the first time the United States thought seriously about using Puerto Rico for naval defense. Remember, the Panama Canal opened in 1914. Americans are worried about this. The fear is that by doing nothing, what could happen is that Germany could end up with properties in Canada, and let's take the crazy out of the Canada situation. Let's say they just take Halifax, the great naval base in the east, and Esquimalt, the great naval base in the west, along with Martinique and, let's say, Jamaica. Is that a strategic future Americans can live with? The answer is no. The Pancho Villa raid seems to suggest that Mexico is interested in working with the Germans. And on this map, Mexico is listed as the province of Mexico, with Wilhelmsburg as its capital. The west coast is listed as Japonica. Florida is listed as Turconia. Those are two states that are allied to Germany. Baja California is Astriana. Do you want to live with a situation in which Germany has part of British possessions and French possessions in North America on either side of you, alliances with Mexico and alliances with Japan? Is that a strategic future you're willing to live with? And the answer for a lot of Americans is no. That's not acceptable. The question is, what do you want to do about it? Now, of course, the other thing that comes up, you can see the map gets a little bit crazy here. New Prussia, right? Washington, D.C. is New Berlin. Pittsburgh is Kruppsburg. Chicago is Schlotterhaus on here. Out on the west, there is a Boyed City and a von Papen, named after those two German diplomats that Wilson expelled from the United States. Right? There's a lot of this kind of fear going on. I bought, there's a series of teenage pulp fiction books, one called The Defense of Washington, Defense of Pittsburgh, and Defense of Cincinnati. They're kind of a red dawn of 1916, where the Army has failed because it wasn't prepared, and it's a bunch of teenagers who have to, fight off these crazy Germans who show up in the United States. It's not that Americans are necessarily worried about that, but that's in the popular fiction literature too. The one for Pittsburgh ends with this beautiful discussion where one kid turns to the other, one teenager turns to the other and says, at least we know that we weren't at fault here. The second teenager says, yes, we were, by not preparing. Right? It's an argument for preparedness more than just prevention. A lot of Americans probably looked at this map and said, that's insane. This is nothing to worry about. Then in the spring of 1917, three things are going to happen. The most important of which is the discovery of something called the Zimmermann telegram, sent from the German government in Berlin through the American wire offices in Washington, because the United States was still neutral, and then retransmitted to Mexico City. The Zimmermann telegram says, we, Germany, intend to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. This was released 101 years ago last week. When we do, we think the Americans are going to declare war. If the Americans do declare war, we want you, the German embassy in Mexico, to approach the Mexican government. If they will invade the southern United States, we will guarantee that they get back Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico. We also want the Mexican government to approach the Japanese government about the formation of a German-Japanese alliance, German-Mexican-Japanese alliance, aimed at the United States. Zimmermann telegram proves that this is more than the fears of a couple of people for Life magazine. And the Zimmermann telegram has a fascinating history in and of itself. Woodrow Wilson's decision was not to release it as a U.S. government release, but to give it to people in the New York media and let them put it in the newspapers, which they did. It gets back to Germany. Somebody asks Arthur Zimmermann, did you really write that telegram? And Zimmermann says, yes, I did. Figuring that he's caught. What's the point in hiding it? Now Americans can look at this map and say, I should have been believing this all along. It's in black and white. They've proven it, that this is what they want to do. Then the Germans did resume unrestricted submarine warfare. At which point, Woodrow Wilson still said, I don't want to do anything until the Germans commit what he called the overt act, meaning they have to actually sink a ship first. It's at that point that Theodore Roosevelt said, if Wilson doesn't declare war soon, I will, and here's the quote, skin him alive. What becomes obvious to the United States is that this war is going to drag them in. When do you do it? Wilson had a cabinet meeting in which two of his cabinet officials, including his own son-in-law, the Secretary of the Treasury, William Gibbs McAdoo, told Wilson he has to declare war, because if he doesn't, the U.S. Senate might declare it without him. Events are happening faster than Wilson can control them, and you'll note Wilson's not a part of this presentation. I don't actually think he's all that important until the war begins. He's behind the curve, he's not in front of it. The third thing that happens is the Russian Revolution in 1917, the first Russian Revolution, which removes the Tsar. It's only then that Americans can seriously start talking about a war to make the world safe for democracy. It's then that Americans can begin to make the argument that just like the American Civil War ended for one cause and ended up destroying slavery, this war, which began for one cause, could end up destroying autocracies and ushering in democracies. If Russia goes democratic, if Germany goes democratic, then Europe will be peaceful. This is a cause worth fighting for. And removing this is definitely a cause worth fighting for. This is in American national interest. Now, just to wrap up, if I'm right about this, and I think I am, what it means is that on November 11th, 1918, most Americans thought they had done what they'd signed on to the war to do. They had removed this threat. That's why, on November 12th, 1918, Americans from California to Knoxville to Carlisle, Pennsylvania, start saying, bring our troops home. The war's won. There's nothing left to do. We want our sons, our uncles, our brothers back. President Wilson, on the other hand, said, no, this was just the first stage. Now we got to enforce a peace. And it's at that point, I think, that the American consensus ends. So I've been teaching this to students a little bit like an hourglass. At the beginning of the war, you got a lot of options and a lot of different things being discussed. By April 1917, you're out of those options. And by the time you get to the peace process, Americans are disagreeing again. What they thought they were doing was this. And let me end by coming back to Mary Roberts Rinehart because it's so powerful. In February 1917, 2 months before Woodrow Wilson declared war, Mary Roberts Rinehart wrote this for the Saturday Evening Post. If in this war we allow the few to fight for us, then as a nation we have died and our ideals have died with us. Though we win, if we have not all borne this burden alike, then do we all lose. What she's saying is, if this war is really about our national survival, no substitution the way we did it in the Civil War. No paying someone else to go fight for you. If it's really about national survival, everybody's got to fight. And remember what I told you, she had 2 teenage sons. We are virtually at war. By the time this is published, perhaps the declaration will have been made. And she, like Theodore Roosevelt, is furious. What is Wilson waiting for? Then she writes, since 1914, Britain and France, not the United States, have been fighting for the ideal on which my country was founded. Under the domination of the Prussians, a distinction that Americans made in 1914. Imperial Germany now threatened those values, not only in Europe but in America itself. For Germany had, quote, broken loose something terrible, something that must be killed or the world dies. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions that you might have. I love this little ladybug is still here. Yes, sir?
Did either of Reinhardt's sons wind up in the army?
I don't know, actually. The question is, did either of Mary Roberts Rinehardt's sons end up in the Army? I actually don't know. Her diary is at the University of Pittsburgh, which is where I read it. Her publications are there. I haven't actually looked yet, and it's actually harder than you might think to track an individual soldier through this. So the simple answer is I don't know, but I can't imagine their mother doing anything but telling them, you have to do this. Whatever that would have meant. Yes, sir, in the back.
With the map up on the screen, did anyone propose at that time building a wall?
No. No, they did not. No, they did not. Yes, ma'am.
Was conscription initiated?
Yes, so what the United States Army did, the question was about conscription. What the U.S. Army did was go to a system of conscription. And they did it for 2 reasons, really. One was they were trying to learn from the British model, which, what happened in 1914, so many young Britons signed up that you ended up with specialty metal workers and farmers in the Army when you would rather have them at home. So one reason for conscription is to do the scientific management of an army, figure out who you want in and who you don't want in. This is what causes such great controversy in Vietnam when college students get that exemption. The second thing that they're doing for conscription is to get at this issue of fairness, to make sure that we're drawing equally throughout the nation. And the conscription decision in the U.S. is a fascinating history that I don't have a lot of time to get into, but suffice to say, in 1917, the U.S. didn't have the kind of records that would let them identify who all these young men were. So they did it on the local level. In Knoxville, it would have been everybody, the local high schools coming down to church or the courthouse or something. It would have made it really difficult not to sign up for the draft. And then what the Army said was, what President Wilson said, we didn't draft anybody, we selected from a nation that volunteered en masse. Which is a nice phrase. Yes, sir?
So, if you were in today's political climate, you could easily see Zimmerman saying, I didn't write that telegram, that's British propaganda. What do you think is the significance of the fact that he actually admitted it?
I think he was doing two things. At least this is what historians that have studied him said. One, he knew the British, if the British had the telegram, he was caught. He knew it. The other thing was, with the telegram out in the open, he can negotiate with Mexico out in the open. He can negotiate with Japan out in the open. May as well turn it into a virtue if you can. The Mexicans immediately said, we're not interested. And Japan had an alliance with Great Britain that would have complicated any anti-American activity. But the suspicions that Japan had anti-American ideas, of course, continue into the post-war world well into the 20s and into the 30s. In this case, there's no doubt. I mean, you can't deny it. The British have a long record. The problem for the British was releasing it in such a way that wouldn't reveal to the Germans that they had broken their codes. So I told you there were two telegrams. One goes Berlin to Washington, the other Washington to Mexico. The differences in the translation and decoding are subtle enough that the Americans released the one that went Washington to Mexico, figuring that the Germans would assume that the leak came on the Mexican end, which is exactly what they figured. Therefore, they don't change their codes. It's pretty brilliant. Yes, sir?
When the United States entered World War II, Germany was over to the English Channel and the Atlantic Ocean. How far was Germany when we entered World War I?
So the German army is about 2/3 of the way from the French border to Paris. So unlike World War II, Paris is never occupied by the Germans in World War I. The big issue is whether or not the armies can continue to fight and continue to take casualties at the level the First World War is imposing them. It's another long story for another lecture and another time, but the question really is, what is it that the people of Europe are fighting for? Because none of the states of Europe can articulate what it is they're fighting for. And when Wilson won re-election in 1916, he did this. He went to the Europeans and he said, tell me what you're fighting for, let's sit down and negotiate this. The French and British wouldn't identify war aims, and the Germans say we're taking everything. So there really is nothing to negotiate over. Yes, sir?
So, how much research have you come across discussing how much Britain and France actively tried to coerce the United States during the war? Because
They're trying everything they can.
Because the Lusitania Medal, aren't most of them fake because they're made in Britain?
No, I'm not, at least not to the best of my knowledge. But yeah, the British and French are doing everything they humanly can do to pull the United States into the war. There are those French and Britons who say, look, the American army is so small and insignificant, and it's going to take them so long to train up anyway. It's okay if their contribution is financial. That's all right. The Germans have made the exact same assumption, which is why they're doing this sabotage campaign, right? I mean, the Americans are funding the British and French war. It doesn't matter what their soldiers are doing. They're making it possible for the British and French to continue fighting. I came across in the French archives a couple of French who referred to the United States as our great neutral ally. Right? They're perfectly happy to have all the money coming through, although they're aware, as that cartoon was showing, that there's going to be a financial price to pay at the end. But yeah, the British and French are doing everything they possibly can to pull the United States into this thing. And it's a tricky thing to do. Yes, sir?
Herbert Hoover was involved with the Belgian relief. What were his views on preparedness?
So Herbert Hoover's an American engineer living in London when all these Americans start just flooding into London. And the war happened so quickly, broke out so quickly, that Daniel Guggenheim of the Guggenheim mining empire showed up in London with 15 cents in his pocket. Right? But smiling ear to ear because he figured out how much money his family was about to make. Hoover was not a big advocate of preparedness. Hoover's focus was relief and charity in Europe. He exchanged a number of really interesting letters with Woodrow Wilson, in which he didn't mention preparedness at all, but he did warn Wilson, this is a fire that can spread. It can catch American interest if you're not careful. But he's not one of the leaders of preparedness. Yes, sir.
Your lecture was great, and it takes the English and American point of view, but could you summarize like a sympathetic argument from the Imperial German side that says why this war has to happen?
So this is the argument that Münsterberg is making. Münsterberg's argument is Germany has become so wealthy and so powerful that the other states are envious of it. The real culprit, he argues, is Russia. What Russia's trying to do is reorient the European map to take control of Poland, take control of Constantinople, take control of the Straits, and reorient power to Russia's side. And the British and French are too stupid to understand this, so they sign an alliance. That's the German argument in a nutshell. Most Americans aren't convinced by that argument at all. And what's interesting to me is how little Russia comes up in American discussions, except among American Jews, who initially when the war begins, oddly enough, historically, ironically enough, most American Jews are pro-German, because Germany is considered relatively enlightened, the Austro-Hungary really enlightened. Russia's the problem. When the Tsar goes away, one American rabbi whose papers are in New York City wrote in his diary, freedom for the Jews. With the Tsar gone, now America can get into this with clean hands. But America can't fight a war if it's going to enforce the Tsar. So the argument of the Germans is that whatever flaws are in the German system, it's democratic. The Russian system is not. And Russia's the real problem. The problem is it doesn't work. So it doesn't work propaganda-wise. So in 1915, the Austrians actually closed their propaganda office in the U.S. And just, it's not working. It's not doing any good. There's H.L. Mencken, the American famous writer, Germans approached Mencken about buying his newspaper. And Mencken wrote this famous piece in which he said, hey, they're trying to influence our elections. They're trying to influence our media. He said, I have 4 German grandparents. He said, until this moment, I never saw that as a contrast on identity. Now, obviously, it is. Yes, ma'am.
So, what do you think are the most enduring legacies of this shift in American attitudes toward warfare that we can see now, the American attitudes toward warfare?
So that's a great question. What are the enduring legacies? I think there is a conflict, especially, we talk about this a lot where I teach senior Army officers, whether American foreign policy and American military affairs should be based on values or they should be based on the pursuit of core interests. If they're based on the pursuit of core interests, then you have to almost say it doesn't really matter what's going on inside some of these countries. Right? So one argument is, well, what do you fight for? You fight to promote democratic values worldwide. This is what George W. Bush was saying in 2003. Or do you fight wars because your narrow interests are at stake? The other issue, I think, that has never gone away, it starts in World War I and has never gone away, and you heard it a lot in the last presidential election, are American interests or values better served by joining international organizations, or are they better served by staying away from those organizations? And that's a debate that begins here. Woodrow Wilson is arguing for League of Nations, all these things, to tie states together, global markets, all this. And some of his opponents, including Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, made exactly the opposite argument. That the more you tie the United States to the rest of the world, the less of America can influence the world. So I think those two debates, I still hear when I think about what Americans are doing. They go right back to this, in my view. Hope that answers your question. Yes, sir?
How best to transport the American Expeditionary Force across the Atlantic? Was there some kind of disagreement between the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy?
Absolutely. So the question is how, so the United States wants to build this army, but it doesn't have enough ships to get them overseas. The American argument is we're going to wait until we build fully formed divisions, that is about 25,000, 22,000 men, with all the components in them, and we're going to send them over. The British say, well, not if you're going to use our ships. Right? If you want to use our ships, you're going to send infantry only. We'll take care of the artillery and everything else on this side of the pond. Get your guys together, and as soon as they're ready, put them on the ships and get them over here. And eventually, that's the compromise that they're going to reach. Though not the compromise, the British win that debate in the first round of it. Send over infantry. So if you look at pictures of American soldiers in the First World War, they're almost always French helmets, French artillery, French airplanes, all those things. That's the deal. As soon as you get your infantry together, get them over here. That's the way we're going to win the war. We're going to take your soldiers, and we're going to put them throughout the Western Front. Even if they don't know what they're doing yet, the sheer number of them will guarantee that we can't lose. And that's the deal that they end up cutting. At least on the shipping issue. What the British would have called the bottoms issue. A British ship is a bottom. Which sounds strange to Americans when you hear things like a debate over bottoms, but that's what it meant. Nick?
Yeah, one of the things I think I might ask you, based on the questions she asked earlier about interest versus values, in 1916, Woodrow Wilson runs for re-election he kept us out of the war. So maybe flash forward from April 1917 to late 1917, early 1918, how he gets to the 14 points,
Yeah.
how he gets to making the world safe for democracy.
So I had a really interesting discussion in Britain last year with a historian of British religion and American religion. This is his argument, and I'm sold by it. Wilson's belief that war is sin, that by entering the United States, putting the United States into this war, he's committing a sin. And you can see it in his declaration of war speech. He's really uncomfortable with this decision that he's made. The corollary to that is that sin can be redeemed. So much of the 14 points, he argues, this colleague of mine argues, and much of Wilson's other public rhetoric is aimed on finding ways to redeem the sin of war. And the way you redeem it is to make sure that this is the last time this ever happens. So this is part of the reason, my friend believes, why Wilson was so inflexible in negotiating with his European partners, and why he was so inflexible in dealing with his American opponents, both in the Democratic and especially in the Republican parties. Because if he's going to redeem sin, that's not something that one negotiates. That's something that has to be absolutist. And that's an attitude that absolutely befuddled the Europeans. So some of you may know when Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, first saw the 14 points, he looked at him and he said, God himself was content to give us just 10. Which is as fantastic a line as there is. Anything else on both lines? Yes, sir.
Can you comment on how the attitudes developed during this period you described contributed to the American population's rejecting Wilson's League of Nations concept?
Great, that's a great question. What I think happens is that Americans are perfectly content and okay with what they did in the war. That is to say, defeating Germany, doing the things the American military did, gets celebrated. It's, the war for civilization is what's put on the medals. And the other favorite example I love of this is when my kids had to read The Great Gatsby. I picked it up and reread it. Every male character in that book is defined by what he did in the First World War. The heroes all served, the villains all ducked it. What they don't agree on, what Americans do not agree on, is what came out of the peace and what came out of the First World War. So there are Americans who accepted what Wilson was trying to do. There were many Americans that either objected to it flat out or were only okay if Wilson made major modifications. So to give you one example, Henry Cabot Lodge's argument, and he's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so he's an important guy. Lodge argued, according to the League of Nations, if Ecuador invades Bolivia, technically the United States can be forced to send troops, when the U.S. Constitution says that only the Senate can declare war. Therefore, the League of Nations is unconstitutional. Right? These are arguments that Americans are having. What I think is important is, again, there was agreement on the need to stop this. There was far less agreement on whether the League of Nations was the right way to solve the problem in the post-war period. And Henry Cabot Lodge spoke in a way that, the rhetoric is not gone. His argument was, America is better when it operates unfettered by international institutions, and the world is better when America is allowed to operate unfettered by international institutions. And that rhetoric, of course, is as real as tomorrow's headlines. So I think that's what's happening here. There's agreement on this. There's far less agreement on what it's going to mean. And the disillusion that Americans feel kicks in the late 1920s, early 1930s, when it becomes perfectly obvious that you did fight a war, but that the net result was negative, not positive. You're going to have to do this again. Someone's going to have to do it again. We have time for one more, Rob?
Yeah, one more, I think.
Okay, yes, sir. World War II vet gets to ask the last question. Yes, sir. That's you, sir.
Why did the American aviation industry not gear up and take part? As far as I know, not a single American plane was used in combat. They flew the British and the Spanish U-boats. We're trying to find out what Clarence Brown, at the Clarence Brown Theater, he was an aviator in World War I. Jerry and I are trying to get him to the Tennessee Aviation Hall of Fame, and we're trying to find out what planes he flew.
Yeah, that I can't answer, but what I can tell you is that part of the problem was congressional. That is, the United States Congress didn't want to invest in something as expensive as aviation if it didn't think we were going to need it. And then when the war began, there's this huge food fight that's been fairly well researched between senators trying to get the aviation industry in their home state. So it's congressional gridlock as much as it is anything else. So the decision that the United States finally came to is that it wasn't worth building airframes because the French were doing that very well. What we would do is build engines, which the American automobile industry can easily do. A World War I aviation engine, as you well know, is just a V12 automobile engine, a little more complicated than that. So that we could do. What eventually the idea was is that by 1919, 1920, if the war was still going on, then the American aviation industry would have been ready to produce planes at any number that you wanted. But the real reason is congressional gridlock. Another familiar theme.
Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Neiberg.